So I'm going to be doing my talk today on batch processing large data sets. It's going to be quite a practical talk. I'll try to show a lot of code. I'll try to do a bit of live sort of copy paste coding because I like to live dangerously. And hopefully it'll be useful for you to be able to use in your projects. Batch processing is something that I use quite a lot with projects I work on. With my team, we deal with a lot of data, some sites with 100,000 nodes and tons of relationships between those things. So without Drupal, I'm not sure how we would accomplish those kind of things. So yeah, without further ado, I'll start getting into it. So in Drupal, we're spoiled to have so many different ways to deal with batch processing. We're all familiar with using Drush commands. We may have run migrations, which use batches. We've probably all seen that Drupal progress bar go across the screen, even when you're installing Drupal in the first place. Um, we will be covering some main examples today, trying to share code as much as possible so that you can sort of write one chunk of code and use it for many of these different ways. And afterwards, I'll share the repository as well so that you could clone it, try it out, and see how the different bits work. So hopefully it'll be useful and easy to use in your own projects. So I'm Scott User on Drupal.org, Scott_user. I'm the head of web development at Soapbox. And we build big Drupal websites for think tanks. So some of those are like the United Nations University, the Institute for Physical Studies, International Institute for Sustainable Development, projects like that, which publish lots of content. I'm not going to go into presentation mode because I'm going to be switching back and forth between code quite a bit. So think tanks publish lots of content and it gets shared widely throughout their specialties. Each bit of content they have is often given a DOI, which is called the Digital Object Identifier. And they can then push that to central repositories, which then can get basically picked up throughout the internet and people can cite their content. So that's what we're going to use as a demo in this case, but you can use any use case you have, of course. So we're going to have a sort of fake think tank website, and we're going to connect to a open API called Open Citations, which basically scrapes for schema.org citations when publications cite each other. So some other organization cites this organization's publication, and we want to get that data and pull it in. And we want to do that often and across lots and lots of content. So we need to be able to handle that, and Drupal does that very well. So just to kind of touch on how does batching work. So in Drupal sort of speak, we create groups of tasks to run. These are called operations. And we start processing those operations. If we're using a sort of the typical progress bar in Drupal, we're using a batch set. Drupal then stores the operations into a database queue by default, and then starts claiming those operations. So effectively saying, I'm going to be processing this, whether it's via Drush or whether it's via the UI with the progress bar, in a sort of first in, first out order. And if there are failures with that, it's fine. We can just refresh the page if it's in the UI, or we can rerun the drush command, and that operation will still be there, and we can pick up where we left off. I guess the big sort of benefits of using batching when you're dealing with a lot of content is avoiding PHP timeouts, so dealing with anything that needs to run longer than your server allows. Many hosts limit that, including popular Drupal hosts like Pantheon, and avoiding running out of memory. So if you're using something like the UI, you have to make sure that your requests for each sort of chunk of the batch can be handled within the memory you have. But if you're using Drush, it'll automatically detect when you're hitting, let's say, about 60% of your memory, and it'll automatically start a new PHP thread. All these things that we don't need to worry about as developers using Drupal, because Drupal's doing it for us. So it makes it quite handy. We can just focus on our operations, our long-running tasks. So what we have in place already is a publication content type. It's got a custom citations field, and we're going to generate some publications with it. And we've already got an API client because I don't want to focus on those things. So let me just show you. I have no content here at the moment. I have a publication content type, and it has a citation field. This is a custom field that I've created, which essentially allows me to store the DOI, so that's the digital object identifier, which I mentioned before, and the title of the publication citing it. So I want to be able to store for my great publication where else in the world people have cited my publication and what's the DOI of those. So that's our sort of long-running task. So I will go to use devel generate and create. Let's do 100 to make it just a small amount for the demo. So that there was batch processing using devel. You can see it's used throughout Drupal. We've now got a bunch of content, and it has no citation data here. So we've already connected to the Open Citations API in the code, so I'm not going to go through that. It's not really the purpose of this talk, but just to show you why it's a sort of long-running task. So the citations endpoint from Open Citations is not actually telling us the title, so it's not a single API call. It's just giving us which external DOI has cited this. Then we have to make a subsequent API call to their metadata API to actually get the details like the title, author, and so on for that particular DOI. So it's a lot of work for every single publication. If we've got 100,000 of them, we've got a lot of API calls to process. We cannot handle it with a single request, of course, and so we need batching. So first thing that we're going to do is create the intensive task itself. So from Drupal 9.3 plus, there's something called bundle classes that allows me to effectively create a publication class, extending the node class, and I can put some methods on there that'll do our long-running task. So I'm going to bring in PHP Storm. Yes. We'll just see you can hear me breathing in there, so maybe I better move it away. So this is what I call live copy paste coding. So I'm just going to clear the cache. What I've done here is I've said for the publication bundle, I want to use a different class instead of the node class. So that class I've done here, publication class, and I've extended the node entity. And there I've done our long-running task. So I'm calling our API to get all the citations. So we've got our API client doing that and basically formatting it in the format that the citations field expects. So that's the title and DOI, and I want to store it there. So that's our sort of long-running task on there. And if I want to test that task, I'm just going to add a little bit of code here. Is it big enough? I need to make it a bit bigger, isn't it? Better. Okay. So what I've output here is just the results of the API. So I've loaded citations for a specific DOI, and I want to output that. The next step that I want to do is I want to store that data onto this node as a test, just to make sure that this is working. So I'll throw in that. now we can see we have some DOIs there. So we know our code is working. Now we need to run this in batch against all our content. So let's start with creating a batch processing class. So this is where the sort of magic happens. I'm going to start with a simple example of how to do that. So these are the sort of basics of the class. So we've got uh, something that's optional. You could do this sort of initiating of a batch processing anywhere you want. We want to put it in a central location so that we can basically reuse this, whether we're triggering it from a form, from a drush command, via migration, anything like that. So we have a central place where we're initiating our batch. In this case, in this example, I'm generating an array of 1,000,000 numbers, just to give an example of a lot of content that we need to process. And we need two things. We need an operation callback. So this is where you actually do your work. So 1,000,000 times we need to call this operation. And when we're done processing them all, we need to call the finished callback. So these are methods that we have on the class. So we have our finished callback and we have our operation callback there. We then can use the batch builder tool in Drupal, which basically at a minimum we need to set the title and we need to set the finish callback, and then we need to add our operations. So if you were to add multiple operations, you would get multiple progress bars. So once the progress bar finishes, it'll start again with another progress bar. So an example might be grab data from one API, finish that for all your content, grab data from another API, generate a bunch of CSV outputs, generate some PDFs of it. Those you could all do as sort of separate operations. If something fails in one of your operations, again, you can just sort of go back and refresh it. It'll pick up where you left off, or run the drush command again, and so on. So in our operation callback, when we first start, Drupal provides a couple bits of information. So it provides an empty sandbox variable. This is the bit of information that's going to get passed every time our operation gets called. It persists throughout the calls. So when we want to store information that all of the calls need to know, we can put it here. So a useful thing is the progress. So how far are we? And this basically allows us to know which is the next sort of item we need to process. It allows us to store, for instance, a count. So we want to know how far we can go. This is not necessary. So sometimes you may have an API which doesn't tell you a total count. It may tell you just that there's a next page. So you don't know the percentage. And this is where this finished bit comes in. So finished equals 1 basically means the progress bar should be at 100% and we should progress to our finished callback. If you set it to anything lower than 1, Drupal will continue to call this operation callback. So you can keep going as long as you want until you decide to change it to 1. It'll just keep going. So if you have 100 items and you want to say that the progress bar is 50% because you processed 50, you set it to 0.5. And obviously you can do that with a little bit of math. So our progress divided by our max. If you don't know the total amount, the best you can do is guess. And that's why sometimes you get these annoying progress bars on websites where they're kind of jumping around because you don't know what the total is going to be. That can happen if you don't know the total. And in this case, we are going to process 1,000 at once because we have nothing really to process, so it's going to be quick, but you could obviously you could do one at a time. Processing 1,000,000, it'll just take a long time to go. And we want to send a message to the progress bar to say what's actually happening, give some context to the user. And so in this case, we've got a little while loop going through 1,000. Once it's done 1,000 from our 1,000,000, it will stop the operation and wait till the sort of next call. So we need some way to call this. I will add a form as a sort of simplest way to do it. In order to get to our form, we're going to need a menu link and routing for it. Okay, so what I've done here is I've added a route within the admin configuration area, citations update form, and I've created that form, which just extends form base, our sort of typical form. I should comment that out for now. That won't exist yet. And I've just added some info text, an update button, and I'm calling our initiate batch processing. So nothing special there. If I clear the cache, we should have it show up. Just get rid of sample code. So we've got now this update citations form. It has this update now button, and you can see we're processing about 1,000 at a time. It's updating when it can, and it's got 1,000,000 rows to go through. Obviously, if we have a much longer running task, it's going to take a long ways to go. And again, if you do cancel, it picks up where it left off. And that's happening because we have this batch ID here, and it can check where was our batch ID stopped. I won't go into the details as to why that works like that. So that was an admin form triggering a batch. Let's actually make it trigger our real batch to work on the citations. So in our real batch, we have the same thing going on. We've got some additional messages that we've added to be more helpful, but we have the same operation. Just a note, as long as you're calling this from within a form submit, you don't need to do anything other than batch set. If you are calling this anywhere else in your code, so somewhere that isn't a form, you have to do batch process as well, depending on the context. If you're running it via Drush, there's a different command for that, and I'll show that. So there's a couple nuances between the different ways you're running it. I've added this sort of detail about how each of these bits work into the comments. So when you want to look at the GitHub repo afterwards, you can take a look. One of the sort of gotchas is if you're in the UI, you have a progress bar, and you can see how that's going. But if you're in Drush, you don't have a progress bar. If you're doing a migration, you don't have a progress bar. If you're doing an update hook, you don't have a progress bar. So you want a more useful message for anybody who's using the PHP server API of a CLI to actually have a percentage there. So you can see I'm just doing the calculation of progress divided by the max. And that'll be a fraction of 1. So we need to multiply that by 100. And we'll have a message. If it's via the UI, we can just say the update because we're going to have a progress percentage. And then all we're doing is for each of our items, so we've got an array of node IDs. For all the publications, we can load the node, update its citations, and save it. So if I now do this, we have our new form running. And you can see we're updating our individual citations there. So obviously this is a lot slower because we're running multiple API calls. I was trying to be nice to the Open Citations API, so if we do more than 6 API calls, it just uses a cached result. I didn't want to hurt their servers during the demo. You can also do things like put a sleep in your code to not worry about that. Okay, so the next thing we can do is a drush command. Again, this is going to be pretty straightforward to do. There's just a couple files we need. So we need a drush services YAML file. And this one is essentially just pointing to a class which extends drush command. So we need our drush command. And you can see there's not much happening here. When you extend drush command, it's the at command part, this sort of annotation that says what is the drush command that we can actually run. So drush update citations would be our command here. We initiate our batch processing, but like I warned before, when we're not in a form submit, it's not automatically starting our batch process. We need to actually tell Drupal or tell Drush to start our batch process, and we need a separate finished command. So I will clear the cache so that it recognizes our new command. And you can see the same thing output, except because it's through the PHP CLI, we need our percentage there. So I'm not going to let that go the whole way, of course. So we've used the same code for our UI form and for our drush command. A lot of times you may have a case where you want to do some long-running tasks after saving a piece of content. An example might be after saving, regenerating spreadsheets, regenerating PDF version of the content, or that kind of thing, triggering external APIs. And so you can also do the same thing on node form save with an update button, triggering the batch process. So to do that, it's again very little code. We just need to add our submit button. So here we're calling it save and update citation data. And we're just combining it with the existing form action submit data because we want everything from Drupal to still run. So we still want it to actually save the node and so on. And then we give it our callback, so node form submit. And we can initiate our batch processing, and that's it. That should be all we need to run, again, the same batch from a different way. So we have our button, it saves the node, and starts the citation batch. So fairly simple example, but hopefully may come in handy somewhere. Then we have something called actions in Drupal core. So actions are what you see when you're on the content page. You get a list of actions here, just as an example of how they're used. But there's a contrib module, which many of you may know, called views bulk operations, and that provides a class that we can extend for action that automatically makes it into a batch. So in this case, we are not using our batch processing, and we're allowing views bulk operations to do the work, because why reinvent the wheel, of course. So let's create our action plugin. So this class requires us to have an access method. I've literally just copy pasted exactly what they have as their sort of example access, so I've not done any change to that. It's not the important bit here. The important bit here is the entity we're operating on. So again, so the views bulk operations handling the batch for us, so all we need to do is our long running task. So we'll call the same task we called in our batch file, update open citations. And it won't appear straight away because we actually have to make a change to the view first to use views bulk operations instead of the default operations. So get rid of this one. Add the views bulk operations field. And here we have its option to process in a batch, and we can decide how many we want to process at once. I'll just say 1. Let's put our checkboxes at the beginning of the list. Go back to the content page. I must have done something. Ah, yes. I need to allow it to use our action. So now we have update citations from open citations. And again, it's running a batch process for that. So this is another way which can be useful to trigger batches when you want to have people run operations on a selection of things. So let's say they want to update all publications that are by a certain author because they know that the citation data has changed globally for that author. They can do a filter by an author and update only those ones. So you're putting the power into the hands of the editor there. Hook update. So sometimes we have a update of content which maybe we need to change our 100,000 pieces of content, and doing it in a simple normal hook update is going to be too intense. It's going to run out of time, run out of memory, and that sort of thing. So the update hooks in Drupal have a little sandbox variable, which many of you may have seen, and we're going to take advantage of that one. So this sandbox is the exact same sandbox with one exception for the same batches we ran from the UI. So we can pass it our items, so getting our node IDs, and we pass that to the operation callback. The only sort of gotcha with that is the normal batch via the UI or via Drush expects to have finished without a hash, and the sandbox for hook updates needs a hash in front of it. So the simplest way around that is basically just storing the finished into hash finished, and then we can pass back the message. And that's the only sort of special thing you need for the hook update, and we should be able to run it. Oops. Okay, I think what I'm going to do, because I think I've run this already, so I'm just going to make a second one. I can't remember the command to reset it back. So I'll cheat a little bit. Okay, so we have our new hook update, and this should run in batch. So there we go. So you can do the same thing with a deploy script. So maybe not everybody's familiar with it, but if you run drush deploy, it also allows you to make updates after configuration has been installed, whereas a normal hook update happens before the configuration is installed. So let's say you want to deploy a new field and then update that field, you can use the deploy.php instead of the install file to run your update. And last sort of example we're going to use is migrations. They're designed, of course, to handle lots and lots of content. Sometimes they're used to process sort of continual migrations. I think there was another talk on that this week at some point. We're just going to do a quick example with a CSV as a source for simplicity. So I'm going to grab that CSV file. You can see our CSV here has title, body, and DOI field. We're going to use that DOI field in order to we'll use that DOI field in order to run our batch process. So again, this is another example where the batch processing is handled for us. We don't need our specific open citations batches, and we can have it run here. So what I've done here is for field citations, we've made a custom plugin called Citations, and we're passing it to DOI. So we need that migrate plugin. And what we're doing here is getting the citations from the API, storing it in the data Drupal, in the format Drupal expects for that field citations. And then we can run our migration script. I did put it in the wrong spot. Thank you. Good eye. To reset the status because of my failure. And there we go. That should result in our migration using our long-running task in combination. And yes, we have citation data coming through. So a bunch of different examples on how to use the batch APIs in Drupal, different ways to write your code and share that between multiple operations. So we went through having an admin form, trigger it, Drush command, saving from a node as a views bulk operation, action plugin using hook update, and migration. Hopefully you find it practical and useful in your projects. Yeah, thank you very much for your time. I'll just go on to the thanks for the sponsors, Calibrate and Drop Solid, and gold and silver sponsors, and stay in touch. So if anybody has any questions, happy to answer. I can throw you the cube. Gotta pass it back.
Hi. First of all, thanks for the presentation. It was really interesting. The question I have is relating to the number you passed as a parameter to determine how many items it processes at once. So in one example, you use 1,000. In another example, you used 1. Is there like a strategy to determine that number? And then a follow-up question, if you use, for example, 1,000 and it fails on the 500th one, what happens? Does that whole step of 1,000 get cancelled? And how do you handle that in a decent way?
So if that particular one fails, it's gonna start at the start of that one again. So you need to make sure then in your case that you're updating if you are doing like a creation. Um, the best strategy I have for it has been to see how long it takes to run one and basically do the math in terms of what's your timeout, keep it small. Um, so I mean the safest thing is to do just one at a time. But if you know your task is very, let's say you're writing CSV rows and each row takes 10 milliseconds to write, then you're probably safe to do 100 rows or something at a time. Um, it's just kind of trying to future proof, thinking of what might happen. What's a sort of edge case for your data.
Yeah, because I found that it's difficult to determine, like, especially for updating or creating nodes and not overloading your database, and to find that threshold where it's quick enough to be usable, but also not as intense
Yeah,
to handle that.
I think in that case as well, because Drush doesn't have the overhead of spinning up the whole sort of Drupal kernel each time, fully. I think it's also a bit quicker that way. But yeah, if you're doing it via the UI with the progress bar, then there's definitely an overhead of splitting it into groups of one rather than 10 or 50. Yeah.
Yeah. And then I have one other question, if that's okay. Like, you also have the queue API instead of the batch API. Do you have any examples when it's more useful to use the one instead of the other, or like some use cases in terms of that?
Yeah, so I didn't show you the code of the API here because I did a bit of stuff in here to basically say get a maximum of 2 citations. So you'll see this if you look up the repo. But actually, this is a long-running task itself, potentially, that needs a batch in itself for each single publication. So there's some publications that have 50, 100 different citations because they've been around for years and so many other publications have cited them, and that in itself could use an operation. And so in that sense, instead of putting all publications into sort of one batch process and running them as separate operations, they could each be an operation on their own. And so to do that, you would just effectively add operation in a loop for each item, and those then all go into the queue. So each operation you add is going into the queue, but within that queue, the single queue item is that batch being processed. Yeah. So in this example, if I was to do this in in a real world scenario, I would probably add them all as every node is a separate operation for that reason.
Okay, makes sense. Thank you.
Anybody else? One up here. Oh.
Test. Let's say we start a batch in the UI and it takes for 2 hours. We don't want the webmaster to wait for 2 hours. Is there, in your opinion, a good way to push it to the backend and process it? In the backend.
I might do it as a Drush command then, and have it run by cron, and that way we don't need to sort of worry about it on the front end. Because I mean, if you're doing it via your laptop, it could go to sleep or something. And it could stop. And basically, when a batch gets stopped, there is some time where you can sort of reprocess it, refresh the page. Let's say you lost connection, but eventually it gets sort of considered stale. And then Drupal will clean it up, so it won't leave the sort of the batch, the queue sitting there. So at that point, you wouldn't have everything processed. So it might be safer then to have it, run as a cron.
Yeah, and can we share the context in the UI and in the backend?
Don't know that. It's maybe worth trying.
Okay.
Anybody else? I think we're almost out of time anyway, so can let you off 5 minutes early. Great. Thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of the week.